Some places aren't sold for what they're worth, but for what they're hiding. The first thing Caleb Turner noticed wasn't the silence. It was how the wind refused to settle, as if the land itself couldn't decide whether to breathe or hold its breath. 3 days earlier, he had stood in a cramped office off a dusty highway outside Amarillo, signing papers for a ranch no one else wanted, a property priced at $1 single, a number so small it felt like a mistake rather than a transaction. And yet the man across the desk never smiled, never joked, just slid the pen forward and avoided Caleb's eyes as though eye contact might pass along something he didn't want to carry. The ranch sat on nearly 40 acres of dry Texas land, fenced but forgotten, a stretch of brittle grass and sagging wood that hadn't seen care in years, maybe longer. And as Caleb's pickup rattled down the narrow dirt road leading to it, the sky above hung low and pale, the kind of sky that made distance feel endless and time feel slower than it should. He had bought it because he had nothing left not to risk, no steady work, no family waiting, no reason to stay where he had been. Just a quiet, hollow kind of stubbornness that told him starting over, even in a place like this, had to be better than standing still. The gate creaked when he pushed it open, the metal dragging against dry earth, and for a moment he paused there, one hand resting on the rusted bar, listening, not expecting anything, but noticing anyway how the usual sounds of land, birds, insects, the distant hum of life, felt strangely absent, replaced by something quieter, something that didn't quite feel like emptiness. The house leaned slightly to one side, its paint peeled to gray, windows clouded with dust, and the barn beyond it stood with its wide doors half open, as if someone had left in a hurry and never come back to finish closing it. Caleb parked, stepped out, and let the heat settle into his bones, dry and steady, the kind that didn't press but lingered, and as he moved across the yard, boots crunching on gravel, he caught himself thinking about the way the agent had said it, low and quick, like a warning disguised as small talk. Most folks don't last long out there. He hadn't asked why. He didn't need to. Places like this always came with stories, and stories didn't change what a man had to do. He reached the barn just as the wind shifted, slipping through the broken boards with a hollow sound that echoed deeper than it should have. And when he stepped inside, the air cooled slightly, carrying the scent of old hay and something faint beneath it, something he couldn't quite name. The space was empty, stalls bare, tools long gone, dust settled thick across every surface. And yet as he stood there, still and listening, a sound reached him, soft, uneven, almost too quiet to trust, a breath that didn't belong to the wind. Caleb didn't move right away. His hand tightened slightly at his side, not from fear, but from something older, something instinctive, the kind that told a man when a place wasn't as empty as it looked. The sound came again, a slow exhale from somewhere deeper inside the barn, and without thinking, Caleb took a step forward, the wood beneath his boots creaking in protest, his eyes adjusting to the dim light as they searched the shadows for something that shouldn't have been there, something that, for reasons he didn't yet understand, felt like it had been waiting long before he ever arrived. Caleb moved deeper into the barn with slow, measured steps, the kind a man takes when he does not want to startle whatever might be waiting in the dark, his boots pressing into the packed dirt floor as the faint light from the doorway stretched behind him in long, thin lines, and the sound came again, clearer now, a steady breath drawn in and released as if the building itself had found a pulse after years of silence. He stopped beside the first stall and rested his hand on the wooden rail, feeling the rough grain beneath his fingers, and for a moment he simply listened, letting the quiet settle around him until it was no longer empty, but full of something unseen. Then, from the far end of the barn, a shape shifted, subtle and slow, almost blending with the shadows, and Caleb's eyes narrowed as they adjusted, picking apart the darkness until form separated from shadow and became something real. A horse stood there, still as stone, its body outlined in the dim light that slipped through a broken panel in the wall, its coat a muted gray that seemed to carry the dust of the place itself. And for a second Caleb did not move, not because he was afraid, but because nothing about it made sense. There was no halter, no rope, no feed bucket nearby, no sign that anyone had been here to care for it. And yet the animal stood balanced and alert, its head slightly lowered, its breath slow and even as if it had been there not for hours, but for days, maybe longer. Caleb took another step, then another, each movement quiet, his eyes fixed on the horse as it lifted its head just enough to meet his gaze. And in that moment something passed between them, something steady and unspoken, the kind of understanding that did not need words. The horse did not shy away, did not step back or pin its ears. It simply watched him, calm in a way that felt deliberate, as if his presence was neither surprise nor threat, but something expected. Caleb let out a breath he had not realized he was holding and glanced around the stall again, searching for answers in the details. But there were none, only old wood, scattered dust, and the faint marks of hooves pressed into the ground, overlapping in patterns that suggested the animal had not wandered aimlessly, but stayed, circling within a space it had chosen. He stepped closer to the gate and rested his arm along the top rail, his voice low and steady when he finally spoke, not because he expected a response, but because silence felt too heavy to carry alone. "Easy there," he said, the words slipping into the still air, and the horse's ears flicked once at the sound, a small movement that broke the stillness just enough to prove it was real. Up close, Caleb could see more, the fine lines of muscle beneath the coat, the quiet strength held in the way the animal stood, and the eyes, dark and clear, watching him with a focus that felt almost human. There was no fear in them, only something deeper, something patient. Caleb reached out slowly, his hand hovering for a second before settling against the wood instead of the horse, choosing distance over assumption, and as he did, the animal shifted its weight and took a single step forward, not hurried, not hesitant, just enough to close the space between them. Its breath reached him then, warm and steady, carrying the faint scent of dry grass and dust, and Caleb frowned slightly, because that meant it had been eating, had been finding something to survive on in a place where nothing should have been left. He glanced toward the open barn door behind him, the wide stretch of land beyond it, and then back at the horse, the question forming quietly in his mind, not yet spoken but already heavy with meaning. "How long had you been here?" The horse did not answer, of course, but its gaze did not break, and as the light shifted with the lowering sun, casting longer shadows across the stall, Caleb felt something settle into place inside him. Not an answer, not yet, but the sense that whatever this place had been before, whatever it had lost, had not left entirely, and somehow, without understanding why, he knew that the horse standing in front of him was not just part of the land, but part of whatever story had been left, unfinished beneath it. Caleb stayed there longer than he intended, his hand resting on the rail while the last light of day slipped through the cracks in the barn walls, turning dust into thin streams of gold that drifted slowly between him and the horse, and neither of them seemed in a hurry to move. The air carried a stillness that did not feel empty anymore, but watchful, as if the land itself had taken notice of something returning after a long absence. When Caleb finally stepped back, the horse did not follow, but it did not retreat either. It simply shifted its weight and lowered its head again, as though returning to a task it had paused, and that was when Caleb noticed it clearly for the first time. The ground beneath the horse was different, not by much, just enough to catch the eye of someone used to reading land the way others read words. The dirt there was looser, disturbed and small, repeated marks, shallow grooves where hooves had pressed and scraped in the same place over and over again. Caleb frowned slightly and crouched near the stall gate, his eyes tracing the pattern without stepping inside, respecting the quiet boundary that seemed to exist between them. The marks were not random. They circled a single spot no wider than a few feet across, the center worn down smoother than the edges, as if something had been happening there, again and again, for longer than a few days. He glanced up at the horse, which now watched him again, ears forward, its gaze steady and almost expectant, and for a brief moment Caleb felt a strange pull in his chest, not fear, not quite curiosity, but something closer to recognition, like standing at the edge of a thought that had not fully formed yet. He straightened slowly, brushing his hands against his jeans, and stepped away from the stall, deciding without saying it aloud that whatever answers this place held would not be rushed out in a single evening. Outside, the sky had shifted into deeper shades of copper and fading blue, the kind of dusk that stretched across the plains and made everything feel both closer and farther away at the same time. Caleb walked back toward the house, each step carrying the weight of what he had seen, and the quiet question that had settled into his mind like dust that would not shake loose. The horse had not been startled by him. It had not tried to leave. It had not acted like something lost or trapped. It had stayed, as if it belonged there, or worse, as if it had chosen to remain. Inside the house, the air was stale but still, carrying the faint scent of old wood and forgotten years, and Caleb set his small bag down on the kitchen table, the sound echoing softly through the empty space. He moved through the room slowly, opening windows, letting what little evening breeze there was pass through, but his thoughts stayed behind in the barn, circling that same patch of ground the way the horse had. When night settled fully, it came without ceremony, the sky turning dark in a wide, unbroken stretch above the ranch, stars beginning to show in quiet clusters, and Caleb sat on the edge of the porch steps, listening to the land the way he always had, letting the sounds, or the lack of them, tell him what kind of place he had stepped into. For a while, there was nothing unusual, just the low whisper of wind moving across dry grass, the distant creak of wood adjusting to the cooling air, and then, faint but unmistakable, a sound carried from the barn. A single, deliberate thud. Caleb lifted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing toward the dark shape of the structure in the distance. The sound came again, not loud, not frantic, just steady, measured, like something marking time rather than breaking it. He did not move right away. He simply listened, counting the space between each sound, feeling the rhythm settle into something almost intentional. One step, then another, each one landing in the same place, the same spot he had seen before. Caleb exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him in a thin stream that vanished into the night air, and as he stood, the boards of the porch creaked softly beneath his weight, the sound small against the quiet that stretched across the land. He did not know what he expected to find when he walked back toward the barn, only that the feeling from earlier had not left him. It had deepened, taken root, and now pulled him forward with a quiet certainty he could not explain. Because whatever that horse was doing in the dark, it was not random. And whatever lay beneath that patch of ground, it had already begun to reach up through the surface, waiting for someone willing to see it. The barn seemed darker the second time Caleb stepped inside, not because the light had changed, but because now he knew something was there, something that had been waiting long before he arrived. And the sound met him again before his eyes fully adjusted, a steady, grounded thud against the earth that carried through the still air with quiet persistence. He moved slower this time, each step placed with intention, his gaze fixed toward the far stall where the shape of the horse stood like a shadow carved into the dim light, unmoving except for the subtle rise and fall of its breathing. As he drew closer, the rhythm became clearer, not hurried, not distressed, but deliberate, the horse lifting one hoof and bringing it down against the same patch of dirt with measured consistency, as if marking a place rather than reacting to anything around it. Caleb stopped just outside the stall and rested his hand on the wooden gate again, the familiar roughness grounding him as he watched in silence, counting the beats without realizing it. One, then a pause, then another, each strike landing within inches of the last. The horse did not startle at his presence, did not break its rhythm, but after a few moments it slowed, then stopped, its head turning slightly until one eye met his again, steady and aware, as though acknowledging that he had finally come to see what it had been trying to show. Caleb exhaled slowly and glanced down at the ground inside the stall, the disturbed patch now more visible in the low light, the surface uneven in a way that did not match the rest of the barn floor, the soil there looser, darker, as if it had been turned over more recently than the years of stillness around it would suggest. He crouched again, this time closer, his eyes tracing the edges of the worn circle, noticing how the surrounding dirt had compacted from repeated pressure while the center remained softer, almost hollow in comparison. His fingers hovered just above the ground, not touching yet, as if he needed a moment to decide whether crossing that small distance would change something he was not ready to change. The horse shifted slightly behind him, its presence quiet but unmistakable, and Caleb glanced back at it, searching for some sign, some instinct to guide him, but the animal only watched, calm and unwavering, offering nothing but its attention. He let out a breath and finally reached down, pressing his palm lightly against the disturbed soil, and the difference was immediate. the ground giving just enough under his touch to confirm what his eyes had already begun to suspect. This spot had not simply been stepped on. It had been worked. Repeatedly. With purpose. Caleb straightened slowly, his mind moving through possibilities, none of them settling into certainty, but all of them pointing in the same direction. Something beneath the surface, something hidden, something the horse had not abandoned. He looked around the stall once more, searching for tools, for any sign that whoever had been here before him had left something behind that could explain this. But there was nothing, only old wood, dust, and the quiet presence of the animal that seemed to know more about this place than any man who had walked through it in years. Outside, the wind shifted again, slipping through the gaps in the barn with a low, hollow sound that seemed to echo deeper now, as if it had found something to move around instead of through. Caleb stepped back from the stall, his eyes lingering on that single patch of ground, the image settling into his mind with a weight that would not lift, and as he turned to leave, the horse lowered its head once more, lifting its hoof and bringing it down again in that same measured rhythm. Not louder this time, not faster, just steady, as if reminding him that whatever lay beneath that dirt was not going anywhere, and neither, it seemed, was the truth waiting to be uncovered. Caleb did not sleep much that night, not because the place was unfamiliar, but because the rhythm of that single sound had followed him out of the barn and settled somewhere in the back of his mind, repeating in quiet intervals that refused to fade, like a memory he had not lived yet but could not ignore. He lay on the narrow bed inside the old house, staring at the ceiling where faint cracks traced uneven lines across the wood, listening to the silence between the sounds, and every so often, carried faintly through the open window, it returned, that steady, deliberate thud, never rushed, never random, always the same distance apart, as if time itself had found a place to land. By the time the first light of morning touched the edges of the horizon, Caleb was already awake, sitting on the edge of the bed with his boots half-laced, his thoughts settled into a quiet decision that did not need words. Outside, the air felt cooler, holding on to the last traces of night as the sun began its slow climb, and the land stretched out around him in pale shades of gold and gray, unchanged, and yet not quite the same as it had been the day before. He stepped off the porch and crossed the yard without hesitation, his path leading straight back to the barn as if something inside him had already mapped it out. The doors stood open just as he had left them, the wood creaking softly in the morning breeze, and when he stepped inside, the horse was there, standing in the same stall, in the same place, as though it had not moved at all. For a moment, Caleb simply watched, taking in the stillness, the way the animal held itself with quiet balance, and then the horse shifted its weight and lifted its head, meeting his gaze once more with that same calm awareness. There was no greeting, no sudden movement, only a shared recognition that whatever had begun the night before had not ended. Caleb nodded slightly, a small gesture more to himself than anything else, and moved toward the side of the barn where a few old tools leaned against the wall, half buried in dust and time. He brushed them off one by one, testing their weight, their strength, until he found a shovel that still held together, the handle worn smooth by hands long gone, the metal edge dulled but intact. He carried it back to the stall slowly, not wanting to rush the moment, and paused at the gate, glancing once more at the horse as if asking permission without saying it aloud. The animal did not move away. It stepped back just enough to give him space, its ears flicking once before settling forward again, watching. Caleb stepped inside, the dirt shifting under his boots as he positioned himself over the disturbed patch, the same circle of softened ground that had drawn his attention from the beginning. He drove the edge of the shovel into the soil with steady pressure, not forceful, just enough to break the surface, and the earth gave way more easily than it should have, the blade sinking deeper than expected. He paused, feeling that difference again, the subtle confirmation that this was not untouched land, and then he lifted the shovel, turning the soil over in a slow, deliberate motion. The first layer came up dry and loose, but beneath it the color changed, darker, heavier, as if the ground had been shielding something from the air above. Caleb worked in quiet rhythm, each movement measured, each scoop placed to the side without haste, the sound of metal against earth replacing the steady thud he had heard through the night. The horse stood just behind him, close enough that he could feel its presence without looking, its breathing calm, almost matching his own, and every few moments he sensed it shift, not restlessly, but with a kind of patient anticipation. Minutes stretched into something longer, time losing its edges as the hole deepened inch by inch, and then, without warning, the sound changed. The shovel struck something solid beneath the soil, not stone, not wood, but something that carried a different weight, a dull, hollow resistance that traveled up through the handle and into Caleb's hands. He froze for a moment, the echo of that contact settling into the quiet around him, and slowly, carefully, he knelt down, brushing away the loose dirt with his fingers until the shape beneath began to reveal itself, not fully, not yet, but enough to show that whatever lay buried there had not been placed by chance, and whatever reason it had been left hidden, it had not been forgotten by the one creature that remained to guard it. Caleb did not pull away when the shovel struck that hidden surface, but the moment lingered longer than it should have, the kind of pause that comes when a man realizes he has crossed from guessing into knowing, and whatever lay beneath his hands was no longer just possibility. He brushed more dirt aside, slower now, his fingers tracing the edges of what began to take shape beneath the soil, a flat surface, weathered but intact, its texture different from anything natural, smoother in places, worn in others, as though time had passed over it but never claimed it. The earth around it held tight, packed just enough to suggest it had been covered with intention, not by accident, and Caleb leaned back slightly, resting on his heels as he studied it, his breath steady, his mind quiet in a way that meant he was no longer searching for answers, only uncovering them one layer at a time. Behind him, the horse shifted again, a soft movement that carried through the still air, and Caleb glanced over his shoulder, meeting those same steady eyes that had watched him since the beginning, eyes that did not push or pull, only remained, as if the work he was doing had already been understood long before he ever picked up the shovel. He turned back to the ground and cleared more of the surface, widening the space until the outline became clearer, not large, no more than a few feet across, but deliberate in its placement, centered exactly where the repeated hoof marks had led him. The edges were squared, not perfectly, but enough to show it had been shaped by human hands, and along one side, partially hidden beneath a thin layer of packed soil, something caught the light differently, a faint line of metal, dull but unmistakable. Caleb reached for it carefully, brushing away the remaining dirt until his fingers found it, a handle, small and simple, set flush against the surface as though meant to be missed by anyone who did not already know where to look. He hesitated for a moment, not out of fear, but respect for the weight of what he was about to do, the quiet understanding that whatever had been hidden here had stayed hidden for a reason, and uncovering it would not leave things the same as they had been. The barn seemed to hold its breath with him, the faint creaks of wood settling into silence, the wind outside slipping away until all that remained was the low, steady sound of the horse's breathing behind him. Caleb wrapped his fingers around the handle and tested it gently, feeling the resistance beneath, not locked, not sealed, just held in place by time and the earth itself. He shifted his weight forward and pulled, slow and steady, and at first nothing moved, the ground holding on as though reluctant to let go. But then, with a soft, heavy sound, something gave, the surface lifting just enough to break free from the soil around it. Caleb adjusted his grip and pulled again, the motion smoother this time, and the object beneath the dirt began to rise, not all at once, but inch by inch, revealing itself in quiet pieces rather than sudden clarity. It was a lid, that much was certain now, wooden but reinforced, its edges lined with metal that had dulled with age but still held its shape, and as it lifted, the space beneath it opened into shadow, a hollow that had not seen light in years. Caleb stopped when the lid rose enough to rest against the edge of the hole, his hands steady as he held it there, not rushing to look inside. Not yet, because the moment itself carried a weight that demanded stillness. He sat back again, letting the lid settle, his eyes lingering on the dark opening beneath, and for a long second he did nothing but listen, half expecting the land to answer, to shift, to react in some way to what had just been uncovered. But nothing came, only the quiet, only the steady presence of the horse behind him. Caleb finally turned his head slightly, just enough to see it again, standing where it had always stood, watching not the hole, not the lid, but him, as if the final step did not belong to the ground at all, but to the man who had chosen to uncover it. And in that silence, with the hidden space now open and waiting, Caleb understood something he had not put into words before, that this was never about what was buried, but about being led to it, about a presence that had stayed, that had waited, not to protect the past, but to make sure it was found by the right hands when the time finally came. Caleb leaned forward slowly, his hands resting on the edge of the open lid as his eyes adjusted to the darkness inside, the kind of darkness that did not just come from lack of light, but from years of being undisturbed, untouched, waiting. At first, he saw nothing, only shadow layered over shadow, but as the sunlight from the broken wall shifted slightly, it reached down just enough to catch the outlines within, shapes forming gradually, revealing not emptiness, but contents carefully placed and left behind with intention. He exhaled quietly and reached for the lantern he had brought earlier, striking a small flame that flickered to life before settling into a steady glow. And when he lowered it toward the opening, the light filled the space beneath the floor, pushing back the dark and revealing what had been hidden for so long. Inside was not a single object, but a collection, arranged with care rather than haste, as if someone had taken their time, knowing this place would remain sealed long after they were gone. There were old leather-bound documents stacked to one side, their edges worn but preserved, tied together with a thin cord that had faded but not broken. Beside them rested a small metal box, its surface scratched and dulled, yet still intact, and next to it lay something that caught Caleb's attention more than anything else, a folded cloth, thick and aged, wrapped around an object he could not yet see. He hesitated before reaching in, not because he feared what he might find, but because something about the order of it all felt personal, deliberate, as though this was not simply storage, but a message left behind for someone who would understand it. The horse shifted behind him again, a soft sound of movement that broke the stillness just enough to remind him he was not alone, and Caleb glanced back briefly, meeting those steady eyes once more, finding the same quiet patience there, the same sense that nothing here was accidental. He turned back and reached into the opening, his hands careful as he lifted the documents first, brushing away the thin layer of dust that had settled over them. And as he untied the cord, the paper beneath revealed itself in faded ink and careful handwriting, names, dates, and markings that spoke of ownership, land, and something deeper, something tied to the very ground he now stood on. His eyes moved across the pages slowly, not fully understanding yet, but recognizing enough to know these were records, not abandoned, not forgotten, but intentionally hidden. He set them aside gently and reached for the metal box next, its weight surprising him as he lifted it free from the hollow, the hinge stiff but still working as he opened it, revealing smaller items within, old keys, a pocket watch stopped at a time long past, and beneath them, a photograph, its edges curled slightly with age. Caleb lifted the photograph carefully, bringing it closer to the lantern light, and the image came into view, a man standing in front of this very barn, younger, stronger, with a horse beside him, a horse whose shape and posture felt familiar even through the faded image. Caleb's eyes shifted, instinctively toward the stall behind him, then back to the photograph, the connection forming quietly in his mind without needing confirmation. He set the photograph down slowly and reached for the final item, the one wrapped in cloth, his fingers working the fabric loose with care until it opened, revealing something unexpected, a simple, worn horseshoe, its surface marked with age, but still solid, still whole. He held it in his hands for a moment, turning it slightly in the light, and something about its weight, its presence, felt different from the other items, less like a record of the past, and more like a piece of it carried forward. Caleb sat back on his heels, the contents of the hidden space laid out before him, each piece connected in ways he had not yet fully understood, and as he looked between them, from the documents to the photograph to the horseshoe, the quiet realization began to settle into place, that this was not just a hidden cache, not just something buried and forgotten, but a story preserved beneath the ground, waiting for someone to uncover it and see what had been left behind. Behind him, the horse let out a slow breath, the sound steady and calm, and Caleb did not need to turn to know it was still watching, still present, as if it had always known what lay beneath that patch of earth, and had stayed not to guard it, but to make sure it was never lost entirely. Caleb did not rush to move the items from where he had placed them. Instead, he sat there in the quiet of the barn, the lantern casting a soft, steady glow over the documents, the photograph, and the worn horseshoe, each piece holding its own weight, its own meaning, and yet all of them tied together by something deeper than time alone. He picked up the photograph again, studying it more carefully now, his eyes tracing the outline of the man standing beside the horse, the way his hand rested lightly against the animal's neck, not controlling, not restraining, but connected, the same quiet understanding Caleb had begun to feel without fully naming it. The barn in the background of the photograph matched the one around him, though it stood stronger then. Its wood unbroken, its structure whole. And for a moment Caleb could almost hear what it might have sounded like years ago, filled with movement, with purpose, with life that had not yet faded into memory. He lowered the photograph slowly and turned his attention back to the documents, unfolding one of the pages more fully this time, letting the lantern light fall across the ink, and as he read, the fragments began to form something clearer. Names repeated across multiple pages, ownership transferred, signatures marked with care, but there was something else beneath the surface of the words, something not written directly, but present in the way certain entries stopped abruptly, in the way dates left gaps that stretched longer than they should have. Caleb's brow tightened slightly as he followed the pattern, his finger tracing a line where the last recorded entry ended, not with closure, but with absence, as if whatever had happened next had not been written down at all. He set the page aside and reached for the small metal box again, lifting the pocket watch once more, turning it gently in his hand, noting the time where it had stopped, the hands frozen in a moment that had not moved forward since, and he wondered, not for the first time, if that moment meant something, if it marked an event, a decision, or simply the point where everything had changed for the person who had left these things behind. Behind him, the horse shifted again, stepping once within the stall, the soft sound of its movement grounding Caleb back into the present. And when he turned, he noticed something he had not fully seen before. The horse was not just watching him now. It was watching the items laid out on the ground, its head slightly lowered, its gaze fixed not on Caleb himself, but on the photograph resting beside him. Caleb followed that line of sight slowly, his eyes moving from the horse to the image and back again, and the connection settled into place more firmly this time, no longer just a thought, but something closer to understanding. He rose carefully, holding the photograph in his hand, and stepped closer to the stall, stopping just short of the gate, giving the horse space while still bringing the image into view. The horse did not step back. Instead, it leaned forward slightly, its ears angling toward the photograph, its attention focused in a way that felt unmistakable. Caleb held the image steady, his breath quiet, and for a moment the barn seemed to narrow down to that single point, the living animal and the faded memory standing in silent recognition of one another. Caleb lowered the photograph slowly, his mind moving through the pieces he had uncovered, the records, the objects, the image, and the behavior that had led him here, and the realization came not as a sudden revelation, but as a quiet truth settling into place. This was not just a hidden story. It was a continuation. The horse had not stayed here by accident. It had remained because something tied it to this land, to this place, to what had been left beneath it. Caleb looked back down at the horseshoe in his hand, its worn curve fitting naturally in his palm, and then back at the horse, and for the first time, the question he had been carrying since the beginning shifted into something else, not just what had happened here, but why he had been the one to find it. The barn held that question in its silence, offering no immediate answer, only the quiet presence of a truth that was no longer hidden, waiting for Caleb to understand not just the past that had been uncovered, but the role he now carried within it. Caleb did not speak for a long time after that realization settled in, the kind of silence that does not demand words but instead asks a man to listen more closely to what is already there. And as he stood in the dim light of the barn, the pieces of the past no longer felt separate from the present, but connected in a quiet line that had led, step by step, to this exact moment. He gathered the items slowly, not with urgency, but with care, placing the documents back together, folding the cloth around the horseshoe once more, and setting the photograph gently on top, as though acknowledging that what he held was not just history, but something entrusted to him. The horse remained where it was, watching him with that same steady calm, and when Caleb moved closer to the stall, again, there was no hesitation left in him, no distance he felt the need to keep. He rested his hand against the top rail and then, after a brief pause, extended it further, letting his fingers reach toward the animal for the first time. The horse did not pull away. It stepped forward, closing the small space between them, and lowered its head just enough for Caleb's hand to meet its neck, the contact simple, warm, and steady, like something that had been waiting to happen without needing to be forced. Caleb exhaled slowly, his hand remaining there, feeling the quiet strength beneath the surface, and for the first time since he had arrived, the weight he carried did not feel like something pressing down, but something beginning to lift. Outside, the light had shifted again, the day moving forward in its steady rhythm, but inside the barn, time felt different, not stopped, but aligned, as though past and present had found a place to meet without conflict. Caleb stepped back after a moment, his hand falling to his side, and he looked around the barn once more, seeing it not as something abandoned, but as something unfinished, something that had been waiting not for repair, but for understanding. He moved toward the opening in the floor and carefully lowered the lid back into place, not to hide what he had found, but to protect it, to keep it where it belonged until he was ready to decide what came next. The soil fell back over it with quiet finality, not sealing it away, but returning it to the land that had held it for so long. When he straightened again, the barn felt different, not lighter, but steadier, as if the truth beneath it had settled into its proper place. Caleb walked out into the open air, the sun now higher, casting long, clear shadows across the ranch, and he paused there, taking in the land with a new kind of attention, not searching for what was wrong, but seeing what was possible. The fences still needed mending, the house still needed work, the field still stretched dry and quiet, but none of it felt beyond reach anymore. Behind him, the horse stepped out of the barn for the first time since Caleb had arrived, its movement unhurried, its presence shifting from shadow into light, and it stopped a few yards away, lifting its head as it looked out over the land, the same land it had never left. Caleb watched it for a moment, then nodded once, not as a command, but as an agreement, something unspoken passing between them that did not need to be named. He turned toward the house, the documents and items held carefully in his hands, and as he walked, the path ahead no longer felt empty. It felt chosen, and somewhere behind him, the soft sound of hooves pressed into the earth, not marking a hidden place anymore, but stepping forward into something new, a quiet reminder that sometimes the past does not hold you back. It waits patiently until you are ready to carry it forward, and in doing so, find the direction you were meant to follow all along.